thriving in a shifting market. The main reason that I wanted to lean into this topic today is most of us have been living in a pretty similar market for the last few years, right? So the last 3 years have been the lowest inventory that we've ever seen in 3 consecutive years in the history of real estate. And we've all been living in that same market, right? Slightly different flavors of it, but we were all in a low inventory, highly competitive market. Well, things are starting to shift. So, depending on where you are, like we've got Lisa from Cary, North Carolina. I would imagine what's happening in Cary, North Carolina is a little bit different than what's happening in Massachusetts or Connecticut. However, what we typically see is there are pockets of our country where things tend to happen first, where the shifts show up first, right? And they tend to show up in varying degrees. So it's a really good idea to keep an eye on what is happening in different markets around the country, because if you happen to be in one of those places that tends to lag, right, things show up later for all those folks that are here from New England. We tend to be late to the party and we don't party quite as hard, which means historically we usually don't boom as big, we usually don't crash as hard, and everything happens somewhere else before it happens here with respect to the real estate market, right? The leaders tend to be your Florida, your Arizona, your Texas. I used to say California, and I feel like that's a little different these days. I think North Carolina, South Carolina probably comes right behind those. But typically it's like Arizona, Florida right now, and Texas are the three that things tend to happen first. So the benefit to everybody who trails is it kind of gives us an idea of what's coming our way, right? And we always have to be working the market we're in and preparing for the market that's coming. So as things change, what is that going to look like? Every shifting market shifts our strategies, shifts the skills that matter the most, all these different things. So I feel like now is a really good time to do that because some of us, depending on where we are, we're neck deep in the shift, right? It's a different market than it was 12 months ago, 18 months ago. Some of us are just starting to see very small signs of that shift, and some of us are still very much in a low inventory, prices rising, competitive offers market still. So before we dive into that, let's do the tell me something good. So what's going on in your world? What can we celebrate today?
I just moved over to Keller Williams 2 weeks ago, and
Oh, I
in
love
these
that.
in
Welcome
these
to the
past two
family.
weeks, in these past 2 weeks, I've learned more than the whole year that I spent at my first agency. So,
Oh, I mean, so that is awesome to hear. Not that you learned less for the last year, but that you've learned so much since you've been over. So, welcome to the family. And where do you operate? So, in case anybody has a referral opportunity for you.
yeah, I work out of the Concord office. I see there are a couple other people here who from the Concord office. But I work in that area, like Middlesex County in Massachusetts mostly. But I do some North Shore as well.
Awesome. Very good. Which, by the way, for all the other people from Concord, that's why it pays to unmute and engage, because then you get the opportunity to introduce yourself to other people who might have referrals for your market. So, welcome to the family. Congratulations. What else do we have? Tell me something good. Lindsay, can I pick on you? Perfect. You told me a story about a lead that you got from ChatGPT probably 3 weeks, a month ago. Can you give an update on that and share with everybody what that was? Oh, I think we lost her. Did she hang up? I think she
No, she's
missed.
here, but I
I'm
can't hear
here.
you. Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
I missed part of what you said because I accidentally hung up, but I'm assuming you're talking about my Chat GPT.
Yeah, tell us about that.
So randomly, I got a phone call from a woman the next town over, and I had just gotten out of the shower. I heard the phone ringing. I couldn't get to it in time, so I went as soon as I, you know, threw clothes on, went over, picked up my phone, and saw that I'd missed a call. So I listened to the message real quick. I called her right back. It was a woman from the next town over from me who said, I got your name from Chat GPT and I have a lake listing a house on the lake that I'd like to list. And I said, absolutely, I'd be more than happy to help. And she said, I was the first person that got back to her. And so she is going with me. I met with her. It's $1.5 million listing.
Isn't that crazy? So here's what was crazy about that story. We were doing a class in our market center. And one of the topics we were focusing on is how, which we did the AI series on this webinar, and we dove into some of that, not quite as deep as we did in class, but we were talking about how AI is changing search and that people are already going to large language models and just asking them, who's the best realtor to sell my house here? And I gave a couple examples of agents that I've talked to that have had that experience. And it was the following week in class that Lindsay came in and was like, you're not going to believe this. Guess what happened to me this week? And it was the exact same thing. So it's real. It's already happening and it's just going to continue. But I noticed you weren't unmuting, and I didn't know how the story ended. So I'm really glad it is ending with you getting that listing. But so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else before we dive into the content?
Well, actually, I have a question about that.
Sure.
Do you know how the LLM found you? Was it an SEO? Was it a search? Or does your client not know?
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted, sorry.
I didn't ask her, so I don't know. She said she went into ChatGPT and said, who are the agents I need to talk to for my listing? And 3 names came up, and I wasn't the first name, but I was the first one that either answered or got back to her.
Yeah, so my guess is probably SEO, and maybe you had really good reviews. Do you have reviews online?
So literally, this was right after the class that Matt taught, where we workshopped and sent out text messages or emails to a bunch of people asking them to give us a Google review. So I definitely attribute it to that flurry of activity.
Yeah.
That's great.
So and this is not the topic for today, however, and by the way, Greta, you can go back. They should be posted on the Wealthy Agent YouTube channel. The AI series, where we did dive a little bit deeper into that. But the biggest things with the large language models is one, making sure you have a business Google page and that you're updating it regularly. Most of us will set that page up and sort of set it and forget it. Google says you should be updating that with 3 new photos specifically every single week, because it is actually looking at that content. Second was reviews, making sure you not only have as many reviews as possible, but also that you respond to those reviews. So what we did in that workshop is we just had a simple text message that we spent about 45 minutes cutting and pasting and sending via text. That was basically like hey, I wonder if you could do me a quick favor. Would you mind taking 2 minutes? Yada, yada, yada. And it was just a very short text. 45 minutes, we cut and paste, send as many as we could. By the end of the we went 45 minutes and we were at like 187 reviews that had actually already been published in 45 minutes. People who got the text and did it immediately. By the time we decided we had to at least make it to 200. So we kept going. It took us 57 minutes to get to 200. And then by the time we finished counting, we were at 221. So in less than an hour, we got 221. And by the time we came back to class the following week, I lost count of how many there were, but it had to be 500-600 new reviews for all the people that were in that room. So those things, and then creating hyper local content, are the things that really drive the AI search. So, all right, that being said, let's dive into today's topic. I'm going to share my screen. So today we're going through slides that all of you have access to. These are all from Shift. So if you haven't read the book Shift by Gary Keller, I would encourage you to do it. Now is a great time to do that because we are going into a shift. It's a different kind of shift from when the book was written. The book was written during the banking crash when the market had shifted very significantly, right? One could argue probably the biggest shift in real estate, maybe outside of the shift that we're sort of coming out of right now, as far as like markets that drastically changed, right? Going through the pandemic market where everything boomed. Um, and then we had our inventory shortage, right? It's been a very volatile market since the pandemic. Probably that and the banking crash are the two most dramatic shifts that we've experienced in real estate in the last 20-ish years. And Shift was written as a response to that shift in the market, right? It was a guide for agents to not only survive but thrive in that market. And a lot of the messages are still very relevant today as the market does start to move in a different direction. So we're going to dive in. The thing I do want to stress is, again, you guys have access to all this content inside of Command. If you go to Connect, if you're a part of Keller Williams, we may have some folks here that are not. But if you are, you have access to all of the content from Shift. Again, great content to be reviewing right now. The book's a great book to be reading right now. So the main things we're going to cover is number one, perspective on the market. So that means the buyer's perspective, the seller's perspective, the media's perspective, and your perspective. Your perspective is really number two, right? Creating an opportunity mindset. Number three is mastering your skills, right? When you're in a market that is booming, it tends to create a low skill market, right? People can not only survive, but can potentially thrive in a booming market with low skills. Yet when the market shifts, we need either more skill or we need different skill in order to adapt to that shifting market. Installing key systems, so making sure you get your processes and systems in place to prepare yourself for whatever that shift looks like, and then getting in the game and staying in the game, right? So we're going to lean into each one of those. So perspective number one, how's the market, right? That's the question that everybody always wants to ask a realtor. How's the market? End of the day, people always need to buy and sell real estate, and markets are always shifting, right? Human beings as a whole, we tend to have like the memories of a goldfish, right? We have the experience, and as soon as we get out of the experience, we tend to like forget about that experience, and we're all in on today's environment and today's experience, when the reality is like real estate just cycles, right? It is a little bit less predictable than what it used to be, right? It used to be a very, very predictable 7 to 10 year cycle in real estate. Lately, we've seen more outside forces that are kind of stretching those, where it's a little bit less predictable as to when shifts are going to show up. But the one thing you can guarantee yourself is shifts are going to come. If you stay in the business, you're going to experience buyers markets, sellers markets, balanced markets, all sorts of different things. And we have other unique shifts that are happening in our industry, like the introduction of AI is changing a lot of things within our industry. So you have to shift with those as well. But people are always going to be buying and selling. Markets are always shifting because the markets are cyclical. And at the end of the day, the mindset you want to have when things are changing is that change is opportunity, right? Anytime anything changes, it creates opportunity for somebody. The law of supply and demand, I don't think we need to spend a ton of time on this. I think we all understand whenever demand exceeds supply, we tend to see prices rising. When supply exceeds demand, we tend to see prices going down, right? That's basic law of supply and demand. So here's my question. Somebody unmute. What do you believe in the market that we have just are sort of coming out of, right? And again, some of us are still very much in it, but what would you say were the two most in-demand skills during this market of historically low inventory? What would you say the two most in-demand skills were? You don't have to be right, just guess.
The ability to generate leads through whatever source your primary source is.
Okay, so generating leads. What else?
Knowing your game. Oh, go ahead.
Knowledge.
Knowledge, right? So you hear a lot of times when we're talking about education, there's time and time less, right? There's certain tactics that are timely. There's certain tactics that are timeless, meaning some things are useful and true all the time. Some things are useful and true in the moment, right? I would argue knowledge, right? That's a timeless skill. Regardless of what market you're in, the minute we stop learning, we stop growing, and somebody is getting better than us, right? I'm not saying I'm right. I would argue if you just had to narrow it down to two, it would be finding sellers, right? Because the biggest challenge we had was lack of demand. So, similar to what Lindsay said, how do I find people to do business with? And writing competitive offers, right? There were plenty of buyers who wanted to buy houses. The biggest challenge was, can I find them a house? And if I find them a house, can I actually win the bid? Because most offers were bids, right? We were competing. So really the skill level was, how do I find sellers, right? Because if I actually controlled the inventory, I had a much better experience in this low inventory market. If I was more on the buyer side, then I was heavier on the most challenging part of the business. But I would argue those were the two most important skills during that market, right? Other factors that signal market changes. The seller's market is typically less than 5 months worth of inventory. So anytime we're sitting at less than 5 months of inventory, we are typically in a seller's market. Balanced is considered 5 to 7 months of inventory, and a buyer's market is considered anything more than 7 months of inventory is a buyer's market. I think we can all agree we have been in a seller's market for quite some time now. The other thing that is an interesting stat that I believe we should all understand, and we should know it for our local area. And it does take a little bit of work for you to know it for your local area, because most of the time it's published on a national and regional level, not so much a state level or a county level. But that is understanding the Home Affordability Index. The reason I wanted to talk about this and make sure we at least knew the terminology, understood what it was, is part of the narrative that exists in the market right now is that homes are just too expensive. People just can't afford to buy a home anymore. We actually have to know if that's true or not, right? Like, you hear me talk all the time, if you join me in classes, webinars, whatever the case may be, about there's a story and then there's a reality, and they don't always match. The story is what people believe. The reality is what it actually is. And oftentimes there's a gap between the two, and it's just based on whatever narrative is being pushed, right? So I know in the state of Connecticut, for the longest time, we've heard people talking about, when's the bubble coming? We can't possibly keep appreciating at this level. Yet we went the longest period of time of any state with no appreciation in the entire country, right? When the market crashed from the banking crash, when everybody else recovered, we kind of bounced around the bottom. So the reality is, we were getting equity that we never got all those years. So while, because it was coming so quickly, it felt like a bubble, but the reality was, for most of that, we were still under where we should be, and eventually got to where we should have been the whole time, but it felt like a bubble. So you got to know and understand those. So the pricing index basically is an indicator of how affordable housing is. So the affordability index is the median sales price in your area divided by the required income to qualify for a mortgage at that median price. And the sort of the perfectly balanced is 100. So if you see an affordability, a housing affordability index of 100, that means, and usually the metric is, it requires 25% of the median income in order to qualify for a median priced home mortgage. If that is true, that index will be 100. Okay. So this is an example of how you can calculate an affordability index. When you see that number under 100, when you see that number under 100, you are actually, it's becoming less affordable. If you see it over 100, it's becoming more affordable, right? So again, 100 is exact, starts to go below 100, right? That's a sign of lack of affordability. The lower it goes, the higher it goes is affordability, meaning it takes less than 25% of the median income to afford the mortgage on a median priced home. I would take notes on that equation and I would run those numbers to see what that looks like where you are. At a minimum, what does it look like in your state, right? You could also run it as to what it looks like in your county, right? If you really want to be the neighborhood expert, you can run it on what does that look like in your town. And you might need a little bit of help. You might need to call your lender to get some information to make sure that you're doing it accurately. Greta, I see your hand up.
Yeah. I just ran the numbers for my county, Middlesex County, and it's 79. So like that seems really low. Is that
That does seem very low. So here's what I would do with that. I would reach out to your preferred lender and be like, hey, I just ran some numbers and it seems a little off to me. So I wanted to pick your brain to make sure these metrics are accurate.
okay?
I ran it for Connecticut and it came in at 125.
Wow.
Which also did not seem accurate to me. I was like, that doesn't seem accurate. So it made me curious why it was calculating exactly like that. So my advice would be understand what the equation is and then reach out to your lender partner and say, hey, I want to make sure I can run this as accurately as possible. Could you help me make sure I'm using the right data in order to run these? And then, of course, pull the national stats, which I'm going to go over with you right now. So let's dive into that. So these are from NAR, the National Association of Realtors. And again, they put it out for the country and they put it out for the regions. So you can see here, it shows us 23, 24, and 25, what the median sales prices are, what the mortgage rates were, monthly principal and interest, payment as a percent of income, right? And then you can see what the affordability index is. If you go down to the bottom, they have it regionally. So in the Northeast, according to NAR, last month we were at 98.7 compared to 94.3 a year ago. The Midwest is at 138, so that is high affordability. The South was at 116.5, which would also be high affordability. And the West was at 81%, which would be very low affordability. So again, I think it's important to know, what does that index look like nationally? What does it look like regionally? We all know that real estate is very local. So the more you bring that picture closer to home, the more relevant that information is. But the reason I think this is important, because it's part of our job to help make sure the narrative in the market is accurate so that people understand the reality of the environment that they're working in and what it means to them if they're a buyer and what it means to them if they're a seller. Right? So there's only three ways to close the affordability gap. One is lower home prices. Prices come down and become more affordable. Two is increased borrowing power, which means rates came down, or there is lending options that are available that make the mortgage payment more affordable, right? So it's lower home prices, increased buying power, which is typically going to show up in the form of lower rates, and increased income, right? If income goes up and prices stay the same, it's going to improve the affordability index. If rates drop, that means they have more buying power. It costs less money to get a mortgage, which means affordability is going to go up. And if home prices come down, obviously they're paying the same, but they're paying less money, which will be a lower percentage of their income, and that index is going to go up as well. So in your market, what is the median income? What is the median home price? And what is your affordability index, right? Those are three things that I would encourage you to jot a note and go find the answers to those questions, because it is part of us showing up like a professional and being a true consultant, is that we know our market and we know the metrics that matter to our clients. Right? So another little peek into this, I took a look and pulled some data for some of those windshield markets that we were talking about. So Florida, right? Florida tends to be where things happen often first, and they happen very big. So this is Florida, North Carolina, Arizona, and Texas year over year median sales price. You can see Florida as a state still had increasing property values. They were up by 1.8% in March of 2026. You get to North Carolina, right? That's a fraction of a percent, right? Then we get to Arizona. Prices have actually fallen, looks like probably 1.3-ish%. And you get to Texas, which especially in certain pockets of Texas, they've been in a buyer's market for quite some time. If you look at Texas, they have lost almost as much property value as Florida has gained. It's about 1.8% decrease in property values compared to 1.8% increase in property values, right? So it starts to paint a little bit of a picture. These are just the detailed stats on that, right? Shows us what the median sales price is, what the year over year trend is. Home sold, is it up or is it down, right? So Florida, they're still selling more homes. Year over year, closed sales are up 8.5%. Arizona is home sales are up 9.3%, while the pricing trend is down. Texas is up 3.5% year over year home sold. And North Carolina is up. I need better glasses. I believe that's 1%. I think there's a decimal in there. Shows you your average days on market. So 77, 64, 82, 77, right? You can see a trend here, right? You can see the things that we would expect to see in a shifting market. Month supply, right? Florida's at 5 months, right? They're reaching a balanced market. We said balance was 5 to 7 months worth of inventory. Arizona is at 4. So they're approaching a balanced market. Texas is at 5. So that would be a balanced market. North Carolina is at 4 months of inventory. Right, so it starts to paint the picture, and all the way to the right, it's showing what percent of listings had a price drop. So you've seen almost 31%, almost 33, 30, 26, right? Those are things that we were not seeing in the previous market. So it starts to paint the picture of what might be coming. We have a lot of folks that join us on these webinars from New England, so I pulled the stats for New England as well. So this is median sales price year over year. Taking the trophy is Vermont with 9% increase. Then it drops down for Maine. It's probably right around 8-ish. Then Rhode Island sitting right around 6. Connecticut right underneath that, almost 6%, so high 5 point something. And Massachusetts sitting about 3%. New Hampshire has had very little price appreciation. So it kind of paints the same picture. Things are a little bit different. Again, we're late to the party. We're still having pretty big price increases. We're still having very low inventory. But when you start to see this is much slower than what we've seen over the last couple of years. So we're seeing price appreciation softening, which is an early sign. You go to the next set of stats and you'll see the same thing. Connecticut, price trend year over year was up 5.6%. Home sold was down almost 4%, 3.6. You can see the days on market is a very different story, right? 45 days on market, 31, 43, compared to when we were looking at those Sunbelt states. They were in the high 60s to high 70s for days on market, right? Not quite double, but close to what we're still seeing in New England. Again, you go to supply of inventory. We're at 2 months for Connecticut, 3 months for Mass, 2 months for Rhode Island, 3 months for New Hampshire. Connecticut, I can tell you, was sitting at 1 to 1.2 for a very long time. So even though 2 months is very low, we are starting to see the inventory increasing to some degree. And then we look at price drop ratios. Again, they're much lower than when we looked at the Sunbelt states, because again, it's a perfect example of supply and demand playing out. We still have low inventory, so we're still seeing appreciation, we're seeing less price reductions, we still have less days on market. But when you start to look at those other pockets that tend to be the windshield markets, we're seeing a different story. So what's the most important skills in a balanced market? One is finding motivated sellers. I would argue it always is. And especially in a shifting market, finding motivated sellers is the most important skill that you can learn. Pricing correctly, right? As things start to simmer, as we saw in some of those stats, or even go in the other direction as far as values, you have to be much more skilled at pricing, right? When everything is going up, the market's going to fix your pricing, right? It's almost hard to overprice a property. And I say almost, it certainly could be done. Yet, in that kind of market, it tends to correct mistakes. It tends to correct a lack of professionalism where maybe you're not pricing properties correctly, accurately. The market's going to correct it. If you underprice it, well, the market's just going to bid it up and you're going to get them whatever the market will actually allow for. So it tends to fix itself. But as that balances out, that's not as true anymore, which means being able to correctly price a property matters a lot more in a balanced market and or in a buyer's market. Confronting, communicating, and consulting reality. So number one, you have to recognize the market that we're operating in. Number two, you got to be able to communicate it to people in a way that is useful. And number three is being able to consult people, right? In my mind, the difference between communicating and consulting, communicating is information. Consulting is what does this information mean to you and what should you do with it, right? Helping them make decisions that make sense for them based on the reality that they're buying or selling in. Negotiating, right? Again, for the last few years, the degree to which we had to negotiate was predominantly, if you were on the buyer side, writing the strongest offer you could possibly write. And unfortunately, that often meant how high over asking can we go? And how many contingencies can we strip off of this offer? Because without those two things, it was very difficult to be competitive, right? Yet, again, when everything balances out, negotiating becomes really important. How do we negotiate for our buyers? How do we negotiate for our sellers? And where we really have a challenge, what you'll notice for anybody who's been in the business long enough to experience a couple of shifts, when the shift starts, there's a weird standoff that seems to happen. And that standoff is when the power is starting to shift. It hasn't shifted completely. But what often happens, so we've been in a market where, let's be real, most of the power was in the seller's hands. Right? The sellers could kind of call the shots, and the buyers, if they wanted a home, they kind of had to just roll with it. As that shifts, what often tends to happen is the sellers aren't willing to let go of that. They still believe they have full control. And then the buyers suddenly think they have 100% control, right? So there becomes a gap in their perception and reality. So you have sellers trying to do things that they can't do in this market. You have buyers trying to do things that they can't do in this market. Neither party is willing to accept where they really stand in the market. And there's often this weird pause, right? So there's often this weird pause in between the shift of that's kind of a standoff. It's like the buyer staring at the sellers and going, nope, like I still have the ball. I get to call the shots. The other side thinks they have the ball. That's where communication and consulting comes in, right? Our job is to help people who want to buy houses, and help people who want to sell houses, sell houses. Part of what we have to do is remove the ego and make sure the focus is on getting to the finish line, right? Actually accomplishing the thing that they're trying to accomplish, which, by the way, most often where we need to focus is their motivation. What is the reason they're selling to begin with? What is the reason they're buying to begin with, right? We need to get them off of those ego trips and focused on the outcome that they're trying to accomplish. And then lastly is bulletproofing the transactions. One of the other things that comes out of that little standoff is, right, sellers are used to not having to do much. when it comes to home inspections or closing cost credits or whatever the case may be. You've got buyers who are used to not being able to ask for anything. All of a sudden they believe, okay, well, it's my turn. I get to ask for stuff, right? And all of a sudden deals can get real shaky, right? Because sellers still think they don't need to do anything. Buyers think, well, ball's in my court. I get to call the shots now. And next thing you know, deals are blowing up, right? So that's where that confronting the reality, communicating the reality, and consulting around that reality helps to ensure that that doesn't happen, so that we can, in fact, negotiate good contracts for all our clients and make sure that those transactions are bulletproof and are going to get to the finish line, right? So what are buyers and sellers thinking? And what's the role of the media, right? A lot of what they believe is what they're hearing in the media. Sellers believe that they have, often when things are shifting, they have an inflated sense of value. So even if you look at some of the markets where maybe they're still appreciating, but just not at the same level. Well, if I'm a seller and I believe, well, I've been watching my neighbors list their house and the next one sells for 10% more, 15% more. If I still believe the market is rising, even though I'm still in a market where I have the advantage, I could lose my advantage because I have an overinflated expectation of what I can actually do in this market, right? So even if, yes, I can sell my house for more than the neighbor, but I might believe I can sell it for too much more, right? And now I actually lose my advantage because I overpriced my property. So it's an inflated sense of value. I can't sell for what they want or what they need or want, right? So the minute I can't call all the shots and get everything I want, all of a sudden it becomes a give and take, right? And a seller's got to decide, am I getting enough to give away whatever I'm giving away, right? And can I sell as is, or do I have to do improvements, right? We know in a balanced market, and definitely in a buyer's market, there's so many things like staging and making small repairs and all these things that when the market is what it has been, I wouldn't say those things are valuable, but if we're having a realistic conversation, they become far less necessary, right? Just because the amount of demand. Again, I still think they're valuable, but they become less necessary. Well, as things balance out, they become very necessary again, right? So when we talk about preparing for what's coming, right? We live in the market we're in and we prepare for the market that's coming. Like, do you have a solid stager? Do you have a solid handyman who can do small repairs? You know, do you have a painter who can come in and do touch-ups and do it quickly? Like, do you have the resources necessary to do the things we used to have to do in order to get a house prepared for the market, right? We haven't necessarily had to do those things. And it's not laziness, right? The reality is if we know the house is going to sell without those things, right, we're advising the clients that it might not be worth the time and money to do those things because you probably don't need it to get the return. But again, as it balances out, that's going to be different. So do I know the people that I need to know in order to facilitate those things that will become necessary again? And oftentimes coming out of this, the sellers believe all it takes to sell a house is listed with MLS and do an open house. So that's an expectation that's going to be very hard for sellers to get used to, recognizing that, okay, it's not, and for some of us, it still is, where you can list the house on, Thursday, do your open house on Sunday, go through your multiple offers on Monday, and get them 15% over market value. Some of us are still in that, but most of the country is not anymore, right? So you've got to reset that expectation for the client that it may take more than an open house to get your home sold, right? What are the buyers thinking? Their beliefs are values may continue to go down. So this is where that standoff can happen. Just one of the things that can cause it. If buyers start to see, so we all know like prices are going up and you have buyers who decide to sit on the sideline because mortgage rates are too high or prices are ridiculous, whatever the case may be. The funny thing is when they start going down, the same thing can happen. Buyers will say, you know what? I don't want to buy now while the market is going down because I'm going to buy for X and 2 years from now it's going to be worth less money. That can also create a stalemate, right? Which is ironic because you might have the same consumer saying, I'm not coming into the market while it's appreciating like this. will turn around and say, well, I'm not coming into the market while it's depreciating like this. So we have to find motivated buyers and sellers. Plenty of time to look, so it can lead to buyers being kind of lackadaisical, right? Not having urgency. Sellers will take almost any offer, can be their belief. I can wait for more homes to come on the market if they start to see inventory climbing, right? Then their standards go up. I'm going to wait and see what shows up because this house doesn't have all the things I want. May not be able to get a loan, right? Great time to invest in real estate. These are all things that are going through our consumers' minds during a shift. Most important for us is recognizing that this is the business that we chose to be in, and it is cyclical, right? Market shifts are just a way of life for us. Part of why we are valuable is because hopefully we've experienced them, or we work with people who have experienced them and educated them on us on what it's like to be in a shifting market. And we can help guide people through it. We become more valuable when the market is shifting, right? When everything's skyrocketing, our services are actually devalued, right? The harder it gets, the more valuable we actually become because there's more we have to help them navigate, right? The myth that market determines your success is exactly that. The reality is there's the market and your market, and you get to choose whether or not you participate in the market. We can all acknowledge as the number of sales drop, there are people having the best year of their career, right? The question is just what are the activities I have to do in order to not ride the market, but create my own market? So we have to understand the market at the moment so we can consult on it and educate on it. That doesn't mean we actually have to participate in the trend of the market. We can go out and do the activities so that we have a different direction in our business than what the entire market is seeing. Lead generation. So when a market is booming, both proactive and reactive lead generation work. What I mean by proactive and reactive, proactive is I'm going in and doing lead generation activities every day. I might be calling expireds in a TCPA compliant way. You pick your form of lead generation. You know, the reactive is more I'm dealing with what's coming at me. Well, when everybody's buying homes or everybody's selling homes, there's a lot more coming at us. So we can have a certain level of success even though we're more reactive than we are proactive. When that shifts, all of a sudden, we have to be more proactive because there isn't as much coming at us that we can just react to in order to do business. So your entire business, in all markets, you should be focused on being proactive. But those folks who don't, when the market does shift and shift hard, they're the ones who feel the most amount of pain because they're going to ride that market all the way. So new strategies that are required. Number one, adopt an opportunity mindset, right? That's everything we just talked about. Challenges are actually opportunities in our market. Number two, seek only motivated buyers and sellers, right? When we know there's going to be this standoff, we want to make sure we're spending our time, energy with folks that are actually motivated to buy or sell homes. We need to price ahead of the market, right? The last thing you want to do in a market that is cooling is price it ahead of the market. Right, pricing ahead of the market would mean you're pricing here when the market's going here. That every time will cause a seller to lose the most amount of money, right? They will net the least amount when you try to price in front of a market. You're pricing high when the market is actually cooling and or going in a negative direction from a price appreciation standpoint. Make the condition of the listing stand out. Again, those are those things we talked about, right? Getting back to the basics of prepping a listing to put its best foot forward, if that makes any sense when we put it on the market. Creating urgency with our buyers and qualifying and converting leads, right? These are the things we need to focus on. The new strategies that are required are to communicate with your database, right? Which we should always be doing. Communicate with your database and your audience. Right? We have a lot of different means of communication these days. So that could be your social media, that could be YouTube videos, that could be your email campaigns, that could be all sorts of different things. But it's communicating with our database and our audience, creating, catching, and converting leads. So how do I generate a lead? How do I capture that lead? And how do I convert that lead into an actual human being that I can help buy or sell real estate? Bulletproofing our transactions. Again, during a shift is when you have the most amount of transactions that fall apart. Because again, not all parties involved understand where they are on the field. And that's when we have the most amount of egos getting involved with a transaction, that home inspection issues can become sticky. All sorts of things can happen that can cause a transaction to blow up, right? So really getting good at bulletproofing those transactions, making sure that you're paying attention to contingencies, right? Are you following up with the lender to see how solid this buyer is for your listing? All the different things. Do more with less. The other piece when markets shift is we got to control our expenses, right? In good times, all businesses shouldn't, but often end up putting on a little extra weight, right? Because, okay, you can get by without paying such close attention to every dollar that is going out because there's so much money coming in. And it should never be that way, but it's human nature sometimes. We just allow our businesses to get a little fat and heavy, right? Fat and happy when things are booming. Oftentimes when the market shifts, we don't want to cut things and we go, it's fine. This will come back and I'll be fine. The reality is our business expenses always have to be in line with the market that we're in. So if you got to make adjustments, make adjustments. Anytime a market shifts, that's when you need to be looking very closely at your profit and loss statement. What money am I spending that isn't working for me? Where do I need to cut? What do I need to keep? How do I become more efficient? You have to look closely at all those tools. And then the other thing that I believe is often overlooked, and we did a webinar just a couple of weeks ago where I had a lender come on and talk about different loan products. The reason I did that is because I believe the finance tools that we have in our toolbox have a lot to do with how many transactions we're able to do, how many people we're able to help, how many deals we can put together. Every loan product is a different tool for a different situation. And if we know and understand them all and have good lenders who have them all available, know when to use them, how to use them, it actually helps us grow our business. I think too often we think about mortgage like a secondary thing. I would argue any agent who has a good understanding of what products are available in their market and where they fit into the market is set up to do more business. They just know what tool to pull out, right? Like if you're a electrician, a carpenter, pick your trade. If you got all the tools in the world in your toolbox, but you don't know what any of them are or what to use them for, then the toolbox has no value. That is how we should be thinking about mortgage. So understanding alternative financing options is really important because we might have to be more creative, right? One of the things that came up that I hadn't even thought about is people moving state to state, right? One of the things the lender talked about is maybe you have an offer coming in from another state where homes aren't selling and they have a home to sell, right? One of the products they had was a buy now, sell later program that if you have the listing, that's something you could offer to the buyer to help facilitate them being able to close on their house before they sell the house in that slower market where their home exists. If you don't have access to those tools, that's a deal you say no to. You say no instead of yes and. Yes, we could put a deal together and this is how we would have to do it, right? Without the knowledge of those tools, it's really hard to do that. Here's the other piece of shifts, the theory of equilibrium. The other thing that comes and goes as the market shifts is the agent population, right? So typically in sellers markets, the agent count increases, which means there's more people fighting for every transaction that exists. And in buyers markets, the agent count tends to go down, which means there are less people competing for every transaction that exists. The reality is the agent who stays in the market fully committed in every single market is the agent who wins. I want to show you this. I thought this was a really good graphic. So if you can imagine, this is just showing, right? If this is the market and I have 20% of the market shrinks, but I have 35% of the market shrinks even more, but I now have 50% of the market. I'm doing the same amount of business, but my market share is very different because that means I maintained my business while the market was going down, So it'd be easy to say, okay, that's awesome, but I'm still doing the same amount of business. Number one, yes, that would be true in this scenario, but it also means you're not riding that train down like the majority of the market is. But here's the most important part. When the market comes back, you tend to hold on to your market share. Right? And we've seen it. We saw it in the last shift. Going into the banking crash, my top agents in my office today who do anywhere from, 50 million to 100 and something million, every one of those went into the banking crash roughly about $5-6 million producers. And they were the ones that when the market got hard and everybody else was looking for secondary income or a job or some get rich quick scheme, they put their heads down, focused on real estate, and they all came out the other side $20+ million producers, right? So they held their market share while the market was dropping. And when the market came back, that market share represented a much, much bigger business, right? That's what happens when we stay focused in every shift, right? And continue to stay engaged. So a couple things before we wrap up. Focus on the basics. So assess your skills. What are the skills that I need for a shifting market, depending on where your market is? I believe it's important that we're looking at the signs to go, okay, today my market is this. New England's a really good example because you can already see the quote unquote party starting in other places, and we're not actually in it yet. But that is telling us the party's coming our way, right? So what are the skills that are going to become most important in the market that's coming? And what do I need to learn? What system do I need to have in place? What leverage do I need to have? What people do I need to know that are a part of my network? Always keep learning, right? End of the day, I think it was Karina that said, right, knowledge is the best skill in every market. Focus on your communication. Almost all, you talk about bulletproofing transactions. Most transactions fall apart for lack of communication, right? You can put your finger on a thing and you can say, this deal fell apart because of this thing. I would argue, if you peel that onion a little more, there was communication that could have happened that potentially could have avoided that thing killing that transaction, right? It's just, did we communicate the right things? Did we set the right expectations, right? So communication is huge in a shifting market. Lead generation, right? That's one of those timeless, not timely. Are we showing up and putting in the work every day? Can we have the right pricing conversations with a seller? Right. I remember when I started selling real estate, I caught the tail end of the last boom. And, basically everywhere I showed up, I was delivering good news. They thought their house was worth this. I told them it was worth this. I listed it, got multiple offers, and sold it for this. I looked like a hero. They told their friends, rinse and repeat. Right. And I was like, wow, I'm really good at this. Then the market shifted, and I was like, oh, that had nothing to do with me. Right. All of a sudden now you're showing up and they think their house is worth this. You have to tell them it's worth this. And oh, by the way, it might take 3 to 4 months and we might even have to drop the price. Right. Are you prepared to have those conversations when the market gets there? Are you prepared with lead generation strategies that are going to get you in front of the most motivated buyers and sellers? And do you have systems in place to make sure you can convert every lead you get your hands on into an appointment? So the thing I would encourage you to do is look at your market, look at some of those stats that we shared today, right? Wherever you are, if your market isn't doing what we're seeing in other places, you can rest assured it's coming, right? And again, if you're in a market where we tend to get it later, you should consider yourself blessed. If you're watching what's going on elsewhere, then you have a pretty good idea of what's coming and you can prepare for it. So know your market, always be prospecting, right? Could be a time to look for different lead sources, right? There's that book, Who Moved My Cheese? Well, where'd the cheese go? And how do I go find that cheese, right? What are the problems that are going to come up in this new market? And what is my strategy to solve that problem? Because if we think about bringing value to consumers, it's really what do they want and what are they worried about? How do I get them what they want? How do I help them avoid what they're worried about? If you can do those two things in any market, then you can provide a high level of service and you also know how to target lead opportunities. Make offers that generate response and have a clear, concise, unique selling proposition, right? Why would you do business with me? That is the other piece. As a listing agent, as the market balances, getting a listing is going to become much more competitive, right? When the market is booming, the mentality is one of my favorite postcards. After the market crashed, when I caught the tail end of that good market, and then all of a sudden everything was crashing, and there was a postcard that came out that had, I think it was Donald Duck, Daffy Duck, and Goofy on it. And it literally said, 6 months ago, any of these guys could have sold your house. Today, you need a professional. I thought it was the best postcard on the planet. I was like, that is hilarious. Someone accidentally sent one to me, and I was like, this is hilarious. I love this. And that is the perception. When the market's booming, people think, well, anybody can sell my house in this market. We all know there's a lot more to it, the negotiation and all the other things, yet it's going to become much more competitive. So do you have a competitive listing presentation that communicates your unique value proposition that when you go to a listing appointment and the belief of that seller is very different, it actually matters. Not everybody is going to get me a similar result. Do you have a listing presentation that's going to separate yourself from that group? So I'm going to stop there. It is 12:02. Thoughts, ideas, ahas, anything you want to comment on or share before we jump?
We had one question from the chat.
Okay, what do we got?
Young asked, from the seller side, what are some ways that you found helpful to motivate buyers, like offer deadlines or anything like that?
Sure. So I'll give you my answer, and then anybody who wants to chime in is more than welcome to do that. So the question is, what are some strategies to help motivate buyers, correct?
Yes, from the seller's side. So I assume she means if you're representing the seller, what can you do to motivate buyers?
Sure. So I'm going to give you the generic answer, and then I'll try to give an example. So I think whenever you're trying to create motivation, you've got to figure out who am I trying to motivate? And what is the thing that might stop them from being motivated? If you can figure that out, then you can go to your toolbox and go, what tool do I have that solves that problem? So, example, if you're listing a home in a market where it's 90 days average days on market right now, which people are getting used to, they've got a timeline where they would like to move quicker than that and be able to close quicker than that. Ask yourself, okay, well, what is slowing buyers down in this market? Is it the available inventory? Is it the condition of the property? Is it pricing? So things you could look at is how do I present the property better? Is it a price reduction that is going to make it so attractive to so many buyers that you can recreate a competitive situation in a less competitive market? Is it a mortgage strategy? Are they going to offer funds to buy down the buyer's rate? Right. There are some lenders, by the way, I'm going to say go talk to a lender because I'm not one. There are some companies that offer programs where you can advertise. Like you can do a buy down and offer X amount of money to buy a rate down for a buyer to a certain amount, which you can then, depending on your state regulations, market that under market rate. Right. So if the market is at 6.6% and you can buy that rate down to 6.25 or 6, like whatever the number is, all of a sudden that house costs less money, even though they're paying the same price. So again, those are like examples, but I would say, ask yourself, who am I trying to motivate? What is the thing that might be dampening their motivation? And what is the tool that I have to solve that problem? If you can do that, you can create motivation. So I hope that helps. Anybody else want to throw any other input or feedback on that before we jump?
Well, I have a different question. You were mentioning about the Google business page. Is that on your webinar on YouTube? Do we have to subscribe to it, or it's available?
It is available and you can subscribe. But
Okay,
you have to subscribe to see it. But we did cover how to set up your Google business page.
perfect. Thank you.
Again, the key with that is that you have it, you update it, get as many reviews as you can, reply to all the reviews that you get.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, folks, let me take a quick peek at the calendar. I believe, just want to see where we're at for next week. So it looks like we are on for next week. So we will see you next Tuesday, same time.
All right,
Appreciate it,
thank you.
everybody.
Yep. Bye.